So let's jump right into our series, brand new series, Kingdom Attitudes. If you were here, I don't know, about 4.5 years ago or so, that was when I started at Living Grace. And I can remember I started with a series on grace. I think it was like a 3-week series on grace because I love the name of our church, Living Grace. And so I did a series on grace. And then soon after that, I did a really short series, I think 3 weeks, on our mission. We jump into our mission quite often around here. We talk about our mission and what we're supposed to be about as a church. And I thought this is a good opportunity to do that, brand new at Living Grace. So I did that. And then right after that, I jumped into a series on the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if whoever was around, if you even remember that. The series was called Inside Out, Lessons from the Mount. And we spent 14 weeks in the Sermon on the Mount, and we took a break for Christmas and all that. And I'm sure you remember every word of it. I'm sure you just remember it. You're like, yes, I remember that. No, I'm sure you don't. But maybe you'll remember this. At the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount are the Beatitudes, right? And so when I came to the Beatitudes, I spent one Sunday on all the Beatitudes. Do you remember that? Does anybody remember it? You're probably like, I don't remember that. But one Sunday on the Beatitudes, and I learned something by doing that. The first thing I learned was that was pretty dumb. Second thing I learned is that at some point I wanted to revisit the Beatitudes because there's just so much there that we needed to take a look at. And so here we are today, about 4.5 years later, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to dive into the Beatitudes. Our series is called Kingdom Attitudes. That's what we're calling it. And we're going to spend 8 weeks on the Beatitudes, not 1 week, but 8 weeks. And I want to start with a short recap. You're probably going to wonder why I'm doing this, but you'll see here in a second. I'm going to start with a recap of Israel's story. And if you are around Living Grace and you're here on a regular basis, you know that I often, almost on a weekly basis, go back to the beginning. I go back to the Old Testament. I refer to Genesis and creation. I refer to Israel's story. And I do that quite a bit. Why do I do that? Well, when you're reading a book, you don't start in the beginning or you don't start at the end. You always start at the beginning, right? Now, obviously, with something as large as the Bible, every time you come to it, you're not going to go back and start in the beginning. You'd never get through it. But we have to know the context of where we're at. Every time we open up the scriptures and read, we have to know where we're at in this big story. My wife always tells me that the stories I tell are just way too long. And I say it's because, I have to go back like a long ways. I have to give a lot of context in order to make the story make sense. It's the same way with the scriptures. It's the same way with God's big story. We have to understand the context. We have to understand where we're at in the story, or it won't make a whole lot of sense. Everything we read in the New Testament flows from the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the context for the New Testament. It's the world of the New Testament authors. So everything flows from what we learn about God and creation, his purpose for the world, his purpose for mankind, and how the sin and brokenness of humanity took place in the world, the brokenness that we experience in our world, and how God began to make things right through the people of Israel. Everything flows from the beginning. Everything leads to Jesus. Everything finds fulfillment in Jesus. And so here's just a brief recap of Israel's story. And for many of you, you know this story, but it's always good for us to be reminded. And let's just start with Moses. Many of you know the story of Moses. Moses delivers the people out of Egypt. They pass through the waters of the Red Sea. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, receives the law. He receives the covenant from God, which establishes this relationship between God and his people. They spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness because of their disobedience before entering into the promised land. Eventually, they enter into the promised land, but they break the covenant. And they fail to obey the law over and over and over again. They fail to be the representatives that God wants them to be to the rest of the nations, to draw all the nations to the one true God. They fail in that responsibility. So they're exiled from their land. They're sent away. Eventually, some return to the land, but it's never the same after that. Essentially, it's still as if they're living in exile because they're still being ruled, they're still being oppressed by kings and by nations. But in the midst of all that, the prophets of Israel speak of good news. They speak of gospel. That one day, a king is going to return. A king is going to return and is going to make things right. A king is going to return and deliver the people again, just like Moses did. Throw off their oppressors and set things straight for the nation of Israel. And so they're waiting with anticipation. They're waiting with longing for this king to finally arrive on the scene. So here we come to Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew, some, 600 or so years after the good news prophecy. And we have to pay really careful attention when we start reading the Gospel of Matthew because he arranges his material, he arranges his story of Jesus in a very strategic way to cue in his audience that something big is about to happen, to let everyone know that this is it. This is it. And so, Jesus arrives on the scene, right? Jesus is born. And what happens? They have to escape to Egypt. Mary, Joseph have to take Jesus and they have to flee to Egypt because Herod is after Jesus. What do we read then? In Matthew chapter 2, so Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet Hosea, out of Egypt I've called my son. So just as Israel is delivered from Egypt or was delivered from Egypt, now here is Jesus coming out of Egypt to fulfill this prophecy. Out of Egypt. Now, what happened next in Israel's story? They passed through the waters of the Red Sea. Well, what happens next in Matthew? And right after this passage of coming out of Egypt, chapter 3 of Matthew, Jesus goes through the waters of baptism. Right after the waters of baptism, he's led into the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4 to be tested for 40 days. Now, unlike Israel's 40-year wandering in the wilderness and their 40-year testing, Jesus prevails over his testing, and he begins calling his 12 disciples to him to follow, just like the 12 tribes of Israel. And in Matthew chapter 4, we read this. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. We'll come back to this in a second. But here it is. This is the good news. This is the good news. The king is here. This is what they've been longing for. Let's keep going. So we turn the page then to where we read about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. And it says, now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them, to teach the disciples, teach the crowds of people. Just like Moses went up on the mountainside so long ago to receive the covenant and to receive the law. Here Jesus now goes up on a mountainside and now he's introducing a new covenant and a new way of living. Do you sense the anticipation here for the Israelite people? Such anticipation. A new lawgiver has arrived. The one who's going to overthrow their oppressors. It's going to make things happen, make things right again for the nation. He's here. Here he is. And Jesus here, he's the new Moses, the deliverer. This is the new Exodus that they've been longing for a long time. This is the kingdom that they've been waiting for. Not quite. Not quite. Most of us know what happens next, right? This is where the story takes a dramatic turn in what he's about to teach, in what he's about to proclaim. And so here's what I want us to do. I want us to stand right now, and I want us to read the Beatitudes from the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This is kind of Jesus' kingdom manifesto. Let's read together, and then we'll keep singing in worship. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek. How are we going to get ahead being meek, Jesus? The peacemakers, I thought we were going to overthrow the Romans, not make peace. The persecuted? What in the world is going on here? Now, right before Jesus heads up on the mountainside to speak these words, we read this. And we read part of it earlier. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. Here it is. And healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee and the Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea, the region across from the Jordan, started following him. Crowds of people, the sick, the lame, those who are hurting. I mean, these are the types of people who were in the crowd that day. They were the ones following Jesus, coming to Jesus with all their various needs, their hurts and their pain, the down and out, the forgotten, the worthless, the ones who were thrown out like trash. Here they are, coming to Jesus, the least of these. And Jesus welcomes them. Jesus begins healing them. Jesus begins setting them free. And then here, Jesus pronounces blessings upon them. Blessings upon them. Surprise! I mean, do you understand how shocking and surprising this would have been? I mean, this didn't make any sense. I can imagine, like, someone, or a group of someone's, a group of Pharisees or whatever, like pulling Jesus aside and saying, Jesus, we've got some advice for you here. In order to establish your kingdom, deliver us from our Roman oppressors, you're going to have to get the right kinds of people on the team. And these are not the right kinds of people. Jesus, you're going to have to get some rich people with financial backing, You're going to have to get some strong people to help you in the fight. You're going to have to get powerful people to help rule and to help you get ahead. These are not the blessed kinds of people. And Jesus says, no, this is what my kingdom looks like. These are my kingdom values. These are the people who are included. These are the people who are welcome. These are people who are valued most in my kingdom. We can't really imagine how shocking it would have been to the people. Now, we call these 9 blessings the Beatitudes. And Beatitudes is from a Latin word meaning happy, fortunate, favored, blessed. Blessed by God. And so, but here's a really important thing that we have to note here. these are not ways to be blessed by God. These are not ways to gain God's favor. These are descriptions of who are blessed. God's kingdom is full of these types of people, full of people who live this way, full of people who have these kinds of attitudes. In other words, this is not how to become a kingdom citizen, not how to enter into God's kingdom, but descriptions of what kingdom citizens are like. These are the blessed ones. And so today, we're just going to take a look at the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So is Jesus talking about spiritually poor or economically poor? And this is the question people have been wrestling with this they've been wrestling with this question for a long time. I mean, you'll read one commentary, it'll talk about the economically poor. You'll read another commentary, it's spiritually poor. And why is there such difficulty understanding? Well, you turn to Luke, and Luke gives his version of what Jesus is saying. Luke actually says, he eliminates the in spirit part. He says, blessed are you when you're poor. And so there's, kind of arguments about is it spiritually poor, it's economically poor. But one thing that we need to understand, that in Jesus's day, the economically poor were considered spiritually poor. There was no distinction between the two back then. They didn't separate the two. The two went hand in hand. If you were economically poor, then you were spiritually poor. That's what they thought. And so if you were around for our Christmas series several weeks ago, we did Mary's song. We looked at the Magnificat. So this is going to be a little bit of a review from that, because there's a correlation, there's a connection here. Back in Jesus' day, to be rich was considered blessed by God. The same thing with the healthy. If you were doing well physically, if things were going well for you economically, if generally speaking things were good in your life, then God must be looking with favor upon you. You must have done something right. You must have earned it in some way. To have all this health and this wealth, you must be closer to God. That's what they thought back in that day. So the rich and the healthy and the strong and those who looked good on the outside, they were the ones most recognized. They were elevated to a higher status. They were the ones who would rise to the top. They were the ones who were honored by the world. But the poor, on the other hand, they were considered cursed by God. So remember that the Hebrew word for poor refers to a whole category of people, not just the economically poor. To be poor was more about a person's social status. So it included those who were economically poor, but it also included the social outcasts, those who seemed more broken by this world. The orphans, the widows, the foreigners, the sick, the blind, the lepers, the impure, the hungry, the needy. I mean, these were the outcasts of society, the marginalized, the ones who were destitute. They were the ones that were forgotten and shunned and often despised and shamed and pushed away. In the eyes of the world, these types of people were the ones that they were obviously not experiencing God's blessing, right? They were the ones considered furthest from God. And now here comes Jesus. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says, you've got it all wrong. These are the types of people who are blessed. My kingdom is full of these kinds of people. They're not further from my kingdom. They're closer to my kingdom. In fact, they're the first to be welcomed into my kingdom. Why is Jesus saying this? Well, and I think when we think about this makes a whole lot of sense. Those who seem to have it all together are usually further from God's kingdom, because they really have a hard time sometimes in giving up that trust. They trust in themselves, right? They trust in their health. They trust in their wealth and their savings, and they trust in the work of their hands. They trust in their own physical strength. It's difficult for the rich and the popular and the famous and the healthy and those it's those who are well off to recognize that they have a need. They don't seem to have a need. They're self-sufficient, and they aren't desperate. That's why Jesus said it's harder for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. The poor, on the other hand, they know they're needy. The sick and the diseased, they know they're broken. They're desperate. They're desperate. And that's why many of the poor and the sick and the diseased and the hurting and the needing, they flock to Jesus. They just flock to Jesus. They knew they needed him. The fact is, and we have to be reminded of this, because of our sin, we're all broken. We're all broken. We're all needy. We're all poor. We're all poor. It's just more visible in some. It's more outward. It's more noticeable in others. So the poor in spirit have come to the end of themselves. They've come to the end of themselves. The poor in spirit recognize their desperate need for Jesus. They realize they've got nothing in the bank. They're completely bankrupt. They've got nothing to offer. Completely dependent upon God. God, it's all up to you. It's all up to you, God. Have you been there before? Are you there now? Are you poor in spirit? If so, that's right where you need to be, because that's when God steps in. At the end of self, we find kingdom life. At the end of self, that is where we find kingdom life. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And this is not talking about the promise of heaven someday. This is talking about the life you were created for here and now, the kind of life you were created for. It's the kingdom that Jesus came to establish, this very strange kind of kingdom that he set in motion with his life and his death and his resurrection. So, this kingdom attitude of being poor in spirit, I don't know about you, but this just challenges me in so many different ways. And so I want you to be thinking about how it may be challenging you. And then I'm going to give you an opportunity later to possibly share if you want. But here are 3 ways in which it challenges me. First of all, it keeps me humble. Jesus once told a parable that gives us a glimpse of what being poor in spirit looks like. Luke chapter 18, we've read this before. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And I want to skip the Pharisee for a second. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Have mercy on me, God. I've got nothing to offer. This is all up to you. Have mercy on me, a sinner. And the Apostle Paul also knew what being poor in spirit was like. When he wrote these words in his letter to Timothy, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into this world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. I'm the worst. I've got nothing. I've got nothing. I'm completely bankrupt. Nothing to offer. It's all up to you, God. I'm the worst. And notice it doesn't say, this is the Apostle Paul. He didn't say, of whom I was the worst. He says, I am the worst. Now, currently, I'm the worst. Being poor in spirit is not just a one-time thing. It's not just a one-time decision that you make when you come to Jesus. It's a daily attitude. It's a moment-by-moment attitude. It's coming to the end of ourselves over and over and over and over again. When I'm reminded of the extent of my brokenness and my sin, then I'm also reminded of the depth of God's grace, which keeps me pursuing him. It keeps me relying on him. It keeps me trusting him all the more. It's all you, God. It's all you. In this same parable in Luke chapter 18, we also get a picture of the opposite of poor in spirit. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get. Attitude of being poor in spirit, it challenges me, it keeps me humble, but it also keeps me from comparing my sin and my brokenness with the sin and brokenness of someone else. I mean, when Jesus spoke the words of the Sermon on the Mount, no doubt there were Pharisees in the crowd that day listening, right? They were listening to this, and they were the professional religious people, right? They thought that they were on a higher plane spiritually. They thought that they were closer to God, and so did everyone else. They thought they were closer to God and his kingdom. But the Pharisees, they were just as broken. They were just as sinful as the rest. They just looked better on the outside. You see, when we compare ourselves to others, here's what we do. We tend to minimize our own sin and our own brokenness. We point our fingers and we elevate and we highlight and we try to draw attention to someone else's sin. It's like a smoke screen. Don't look here, look there. We don't want anybody to see what's happening here. Look over there. Look at them. And we hide our own. I'm not that bad. They're worse than me. It's so much easier to focus on someone else's sin while covering up or hiding our own. That's what human beings do. That's what we do. Not being our authentic selves. Church people do this a lot. We're really good at doing this. Looking good on the outside. And this is why community is so important. This is why relationships are so important. Just admitting that we're broken. Admitting our sin, confessing our sin, not hiding it. Jesus' brother James said that that's when you find true healing. You find true healing when you get it out in the open. You say, I'm broken, and I admit that I'm broken. And sometimes we don't even realize the extent of our sin and brokenness. It takes other people in our lives to lovingly come alongside of us and help us recognize it. I've realized I didn't realize how much I was addicted to food until recently. I mean, yeah, and we laugh about that, and it's funny, kinda, but not really. I mean, I would eat whatever I want, whenever I want, and not even paying attention to just putting harmful things in my body time and time and time and time again. And where will that lead? Cutting my life short, maybe. Sickness and disease, I'm realizing that's brokenness. That's brokenness, and that's just as bad as any kind of brokenness I can point out in anybody else. I realize, man, I've been recognizing the pride. I'm so prideful, and I recognize, I say hurtful things all the time to people, and the people that are closest to me, that's brokenness. Sometimes I do it willfully. That's just as sinful and broken as any other sin I could point out in anybody else. I have no right to compare my brokenness with anyone else. Whenever we find ourselves pointing fingers at those people, or even thinking in our mind it's those people that do that or live that way, we need to be reminded that we are those people. We are those people. But for the grace of God, right? But for the grace of God. And maybe those people need to experience the grace of God too. And how will that happen? How will it happen? Seriously, how will they experience the grace of God? It's something that we have to wrestle with and we have to figure out. Which leads me to the third way in which I'm challenged. It keeps me humble, keeps me from comparing. And it challenges me to be more welcoming, like Jesus, just like Jesus. When I come to the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, when I read the teachings of Jesus, my personal kingdom will always be confronted. And the kingdoms of this world will be confronted. My personal kingdoms, my value systems, the things I value, more specifically, who I value. In God's kingdom, what the world sees, and sometimes what the church sees as insignificant, to be thrown out like trash, has extraordinarily great value in God's eyes. And so this should lead me to never write anyone off, even those who seem furthest from God. Those who seem furthest from God in my eyes are usually the ones most broken and the ones most desperate, whether because of something they've done, something that they're currently doing to themselves, or something that's been done to them because of the brokenness of this world that we live in. Either way, they may be closer to God's kingdom than we think, because they're hurting. They're hurting. They're desperate. And we just need to get close enough to hear their story and to understand that. For the desperate people who flock to Jesus in that day, the healing in their lives came through proximity with Jesus. And for those people today, healing and wholeness comes in the same way, through proximity, through relational proximity to God's people, by encountering the grace of those who are broken and undeserving. That's us. By encountering the grace of those who are broken and undeserving, yet have experienced and continue to experience God's grace over and over and over again. We're the people of grace. We're the people that experience grace time and time again. I'm so thankful that I do. Young's translation says this: "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there's more of God and his rule." I like that. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. We're going to spend some time singing and praying and give an opportunity for you to share as well. But here's what we're going to kind of see as we go throughout this series, that these blessings, these Beatitudes, Jesus is the embodiment of these things. This is a picture of Jesus, because, Jesus became poor for our sake, right? And he was broken. He was broken for our brokenness. And so as his kingdom citizens, we follow in his footsteps.